Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the fifth in our series of six webinars. I'm Sarah Marlowe from OxLEP Skills Hub. Our mission is to drive Oxfordshire's economic growth, and we support our community through initiatives like the government-funded social contract programme, with one of the aims being to boost apprenticeship starts and completions in Oxfordshire. So our social contract programme has successfully leveraged £3.6 million now of the Oxfordshire Apprenticeship Levy to create new apprenticeships in the county through levy transfer optimisation. And so far, we have 200 apprenticeships started, with £1.9 million still available for further starts in key sectors such as health and social care, early years education, construction and digital, as well as for specific focuses like women in STEM. We've also secured a contract with the Department for Education to launch boot camps in July. And to learn more about our offers for employers, please look out for the QR code and website at the end of the webinar. So today's webinar is in partnership with Hawke Training again, and is intended to help Oxfordshire employers to navigate the Apprenticeship Endpoint Assessment, or EPA. Our advisor, Andrea Harrison, has developed these webinars as part of the OxLEP Skills offer of pre-funded support for Oxfordshire businesses on all things apprenticeships. And she's particularly focused on supporting a higher level of completions. We encourage those working with apprenticeship employers to raise awareness of OxLEP's skills support offer, and we ourselves have recently needed that support from Andrea through EPA with our own comms and marketing apprentice, so we know how valuable it is. Thank you for joining us today, and to Caroline Walton from Explosive Learning Solutions, who will be supporting with best practice tips, for example. And we hope to see you all again for the final webinar of the series, which I'm sure Andrea will tell you about later. So I'll hand over now to Hawke Training and Andrea. Thank you.
Do you want me to jump straight in, Andrea? Or
yes, please, Mark, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well for
please
you.
Do. Yeah, okay. Nice to meet you all. Good afternoon. My name's Mark Holmes, and I am a curriculum lead at Hawke Training. Curriculum lead means somebody who works very closely with independent endpoint assessing organisations, as well as IFATE, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, as well as designing the resources, the programs, and everything that goes into ensure that each apprentice has the best experience they possibly can while they're on an apprenticeship. Hawke Training are an independent training provider. We're national, in case you're wondering who we are. And I've been as a curriculum lead now for 5-6 years. Before that, Hawke Training, I was a tutor since 2015, so it's nearly 10 years. So I've had 2 or 3 roles, basically within being a tutor first, but then moving into the quality assurance side, and then into this curriculum lead side as well, because it has been recognised, as you may or may not be aware, standards changed in 2017 from frameworks, apprenticeships changed from frameworks to standards. And that needed a whole raft of changes with the mindset, how apprenticeships work, and how apprentices and employers now are required to work much closely together than they ever were in the past, I would suggest. And so my role as a curriculum lead is to ensure that you as an employer, and it may be you as an apprentice, understand what actually is involved in the apprenticeship now. So today we're going to talk about that endpoint assessment and the gateway process and the importance of it. Often, from feedback that I've got, because one of my roles is to speak to apprentices and employers as well, is it's not until they get to that point that they realise how important it was to understand everything that had happened along the line. So this is about ensuring that we're giving you hints and tips and the best approach that you can possibly have to support your apprentice, if you're an employer or if you're an apprentice themselves. So that's me. And if I move the slide on. So as an employer with an apprentice or an apprentice themselves, you will have experience with your apprentice and an apprenticeship journey. And as such, there's this work that goes on at the beginning, which is giving information, advice and guidance, the application process. You're then onboarded, signed up effectively. You will then be on a practical learning period, and that is defined by the apprenticeship itself and the standard. You can be on an apprenticeship a minimum amount of time of 372 days. However, some apprentices are set for, I know for apprentices, I'm going to go 15 months, 16 months, 18 months, 24 months. It's whatever has been designated by IFATE, the Institute for Apprenticeship and Technical Education, have said a recommended length for that apprenticeship. And that is, they've looked at what the apprenticeship is. They work with groups who are called trailblazer groups. So these apprenticeships are set up by employers, with educators, with endpoint assessing organisations to see what they think a generic or the best time that an apprentice should spend on their apprenticeship programme. That is that practical learning period. Now, we're going to talk today about Gateway, and in brackets there, the endpoint assessment itself. But the one thing I'd like to say at this point, if you're a manager of an apprentice, you need to be and you want to be heavily involved at every stage. As a minimum, you should be attending the progress reviews every 12 weeks. But in the back of your mind, if there's two things that you need to think about throughout the whole journey. One is absolutely understanding what your apprentice is going to have to demonstrate in terms of knowledge, skills and behaviours at that endpoint assessment. Also, that you're ensuring that they're gaining their off-the-job training, and there is a minimum requirement on an apprenticeship for a number of hours to demonstrate that endpoint assessment learning. And also, and I say this at this point as well, because it's often forgotten, most apprenticeships, if not all, have an element of functional skills, maths and English. And number of our apprentices and a number of organisations, they're not fully aware that they need to have achieved their maths and English at whatever level, or they've submitted their required exemption certificates. And it's a bit of a shocker for the employer if the apprentice thinks they've got to the end and then they're like, well, you haven't got your maths and English. So I would really encourage you from the very outset to understand exactly what your apprentice has, because it is a massive barrier to apprentices completing, not being aware that they needed functional skills. We've had examples where people have done initial assessments and diagnostics and they think that was the exam. We've had people do part of it, have certificates, but they've either not submitted them or the certificates aren't valid as an exemption. So as an employer, I would absolutely encourage you to ensure that your apprentice is absolutely got the right requirement and the certificates that they need to either exempt them from their functional skills, or if they are having to sit their functional skills at level 1 or level 2, they're working towards that as early as possible in their program, because it's been, I've heard it from lots and lots of people I've spoken to. It can be a barrier not having that and understanding what that is. Excuse me. Most independent training providers will provide support, a lot of detailed focused support to enable your apprentice to get through their functional skills. And part of, I would encourage you as an employer to just ask to see what that support looks like, how your apprentice is working towards that. And all of that sort of discussion, I would encourage you have at least every month, but as a minimum every 12 weeks when you have your progress review, because it's fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental to your apprentice. So before we move on to the endpoint assessment, I guess what I'd like to see this journey. Is anyone on here had an apprentice go through this journey and got to endpoint? I know OxLEP, you've had one because you mentioned it earlier. Has anyone else had an apprentice go through on their apprenticeship journey? What was the experience? What was it like towards the end with the endpoint assessment and that gateway meeting, which we'll talk about in a minute anyway? I can see somebody's typing. No, not yet. All good. Have you got somebody about to go in or a little way off, Emma? Not
Do
seeing.
feel free to pop the mic on if
yeah.
you need to.
They've only just started.
Typing.
Excellent, Emma. You're in a great position, so hopefully you'll be able to sort of take some of these hints and tips, or you might think, oh, that's a good idea, or whatever. And Jenny, you had somebody go through. What did you find in terms of the process and the experience?
I'll be honest, I'm not that close to the detail. We've got around 100 people on qualifications, but I've started the role quite recently and sort of taken over a cohort. So I'm really keen to learn a bit more about it. But some of the comments that you've just shared about people not understanding quite what's involved when they signed up, and understanding, not realizing, think that they've done their 14 months and then suddenly they realize they've got to sit an exam or a professional discussion or and I think particularly for the level 5 where they've got to do a research project, it's a lot of work.
I would say, I know on previous webinars we were talking about it in previous ones, and obviously the recordings and that are out there as well. One of the things we spoke about, and I say to everyone, the importance of the information, advice and guidance session and asking people before they roll to really understand what they're enrolling for is really critical, because you will find a lot of people, like you're saying there, Jenny, what happens is a lot of people do all this work, get all this effort, and they think, oh, I didn't realise there was some sort of assessment or examination at the end, because I know it feels quite recent to me, but it's 7 years ago when they changed from frameworks to standards. Originally, when we had frameworks, it was assessment on the go. But now there is always this endpoint assessment, for a better word, a type of assessment of an exam at the end of their apprenticeship program. And it's about making sure that people really understand, start with the end in mind. What is it I'm aiming for? What is it I'm going to have to do? And also having those really strong conversations with their employer as well, because I mentioned it there about making sure having off-the-job learning. This has become more and more critical now for people on an apprenticeship program, because that's where they're developing their knowledge, skills and behaviours. That's where they're able to practice those and to I know a lot of independent training providers will provide mocks. We certainly do mocks, and the mock exams simulate what the endpoint assessment will look like. Because for some people starting this apprenticeship journey, they'll have had no or very little experience of having an examination in that process, and we'll move on to the different types of ways things are assessed in a while. And it's not like in my mind, before I was involved in this, an examination was 2 papers, sit down for 3 hours, write some stuff down. That was the assessment. That's how it was. You examined that way. Where apprenticeships are very much different and broader and wider. So absolutely, thank you for sharing. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself as I go along, or put something in the chat and we'll get those to you, because you might have something very specific. Because the other thing, which you may not be aware, apprenticeships are very broad and very wide, and there's lots of different specifications. Everyone is unique to that sector as well, and the assessment processes that take place are quite unique and have been designed by the employers in mind, with the employers in mind, with educators supporting as well. So as we can see, I've mentioned there about endpoint assessment, but before that, I really want to talk about this gateway meeting. If you imagine, and it does exactly what it says on the tin, you're going through a gateway. So your apprenticeship will have been doing practical learning period for 14 months, 21 months, whatever it is. And then there is a formal meeting which the employer, the apprentice and the training provider must attend. And at that meeting, there is a discussion that takes place to confirm that, first and foremost, is the apprentice absolutely ready for their endpoint assessment? They know what's expected of them. They've met all the criteria. Is there any concerns or issues that they may have that can be resolved at that point? Also, that's the checkpoint for, have you got your functional skills? Have you acquired your 20% off the job? And all those bits. Because, excuse me, they won't be able to go through to their endpoint assessment if they haven't met those minimum criteria. And there are other criteria depending on the apprenticeship as well. Some apprentices will have to submit at that point a evidence mapping document, or they might have to start to submit a research project, or they might have to submit some evidence that's to be assessed by the independent endpoint assessing organisation. So this gateway meeting is critical, and I would really strongly encourage you as an employer to have it booked and planned in your diary, even at when you sign up. So 12 months down the line, have something in already so you know you're working towards that and your diary's clear, because it's absolutely critical as you as an employer that you are there to support your apprentice and understand what's required. The second part of that gateway is this is something that's relatively newish in terms of apprenticeships now. Employers have a part to play in the endpoint assessment in certain assessment plans. Or I know I deliver to apprenticeship standards where the employer actually has to be present for the professional discussion and the presentation. So as a bare minimum, they have to make sure they're available for those 2 hours, but they might have to be involved in supplying a statement or writing a testimony. There's lots of different involvements that apprenticeship employers can play, so you know what your expectations are as an employer. If you're going to attend the endpoint assessment, what part do you play? Typically, you won't be getting involved in the presentation, but you're there to confirm. So you're not expected there to complete the assessment for your apprentice, but you're there to support. That is a bare minimum. Somebody familiar is on the call is sometimes worth its weight in gold for somebody who's really nervous about their assessment as well. Having a friendly face on, knowing somebody's there, is a really key part as well. And then the final part of that gateway meeting is basically having a plan, because what tends to happen, you'll have the gateway meeting, and then typically the endpoint assessment process can last anywhere from 2 months up to 6 months, depending what they've got to do in that time. That doesn't mean they're being assessed for all that time. There will be specific dates where they need to attend, but depending on the apprenticeship, you as the employer may have to organise for your apprentice to show their skills, to have availability for demonstrating the new learning, the new skills that they've had. And 2 apprenticeships that I work with, which is supply chain warehouse and trade supplier, we have to really plan in with the employer to make sure that the apprentice is actually busy on those days when they're being assessed. There's no point in being observed and there's no customers to deal with. I've had numerous conversations with employers say, oh, we've got a quiet period there, we can do it. And I'm saying, no, you don't want a quiet period, you want a busy period. So you also, as an employer, you might have to think about logistics, because if your apprentice is being assessed, who's going to cover what some of their work they're doing while they're being assessed? You might have to coordinate and organise the team. You definitely have to speak to the team as well to make sure that everyone's aware that the apprentice is being assessed. And so it's a collaborative approach. And you as the employer, I would absolutely really encourage to make sure everyone's aware that their colleague is going through their endpoint assessment. I've been rattling on a bit. I noticed there's something in the chat. Is there anything, or have you answered it, Andrea?
No, it was just a point that Rita made, a really good point about perhaps older learners who can't necessarily find their certificates. I'm one of these sad people that still knows where the Green Cross Code certificate is. For those of you that are old enough to know the Green Cross Code, I know where my certificate is, along with my gymnastics one. But equally, I think when you go for exemptions as well through your training provider, the LAR system will only go back a certain period of time. And that's something to be aware of as well. But again, it's always worthwhile checking with your training provider the exemptions that you can have. Statement of results never used to be accepted, but I believe if they're if they are signed by your school or college, you can use them. But a lot of schools and colleges, if you are perhaps an older learner, might not be in existence anymore, or might not be
There's
happy
a lot of
to
investigation
sign.
that needs to take place, but I would say independent training providers can give you that advice and support how to do it, because there is a number of different things you can do. The other thing to think about as well, you may have apprentices who've completed examinations in Europe, other countries. They can apply for something called ENIC. I think it's ENIC now. Which they and your training provider will be able to tell you how to do that, because they may have equivalencies that they've passed exams, maths and English in whatever country they've done their education system in as well. There's lots of guidance out there, but the one thing I'd really encourage you is to ask, and to ask. Absolutely. Don't, keep asking, because they'll be able to provide you with the right way to get those as well. So
sorry, Mark, just one thing I was going to mention, you probably will touch upon it, that one of the assessment methods being an MCQ multiple choice question exam, is that I previously have come across apprentices who have got to sit this and maybe sitting it remotely, but there might be firewalls set up in their organisation. Sorry.
Hold that chat. I'm going to go on to that now. You and I are thinking alike.
I shall mute.
No, don't do that. You're fine. So we're speaking about this EPA. It's often shortened to EPA, endpoint assessment. Basically, after the practical period of learning, they are ready to complete their endpoint assessment. And there is a number of combinations depending on the apprenticeship standard, how they are assessed. And I'm going to go through a few in turn here. And at that point, if I forget, Andrea, remind me about MCQ as well, because that is a fundamental point. So just to give you, it's meant to be impartial. No, it's not meant to be. It is impartial. It's an endpoint assessment by an independent endpoint assessing organisation who do not know the apprentice and the employer. And it's where they're assessing their knowledge, skills and behaviours. Along the way, I've mentioned it already, we'd really be encouraging the training provider to be completing mocks, a minimum of one mock, but we often do 2 or 3 depending on the requirements. And these endpoint assessments are designed by employers and educators. So it's the employer saying, this apprentice who I'd like to be successful needs to have these skills and this knowledge and these behaviours. We'd like to see them. So they have designed, as well as the assessment plan, the different assessment methods. Throughout each of these, the independent endpoint assessor will be assessing knowledge, skills and behaviours in different ways and a combination. So you will have, and I would say at the beginning of this, one of the key things you want to be discussing with your endpoint, with your training provider is, what are the assessment methods my apprentice is going to be assessed against? There will be, depending on the apprenticeship, observation. So the endpoint assessor, an agreed date and time, will come into your organisation and observe the apprentice demonstrating their skills naturally. And that could last an hour, that could last 3 hours. It's defined in the assessment plan, and they're expecting to see, they'll have criteria they're looking for. They're expecting to see the skills and behaviours. Potentially, a lot of the time now, they're asking people along the way to assess knowledge. So as well as it's almost like a show and tell. The apprentice is encouraged to do a show and tell, which is weird. That's why we encourage mocks. So as well as somebody doing the job, they need to be explaining to somebody why they're doing the things they're doing, which is odd. That is quite an odd scenario, but to encourage them to be able to do that, to talk about why they're demonstrating the skills they have. There might be a practical assessment. So there might be an element where they're assessed about completing a specific task, and the endpoint assessor will be looking at the skills they're using. There may be a scenario. So this is sometimes set up for sometimes called simulation, and it could be for aspects that the apprentice needs to demonstrate, but in reality, you don't want to see it. So my mind jumps straight away to health and safety and things like that. You don't want to see somebody have an accident, but they need to be able to demonstrate to know what they're going to do if there is an issue or an accident. So that jumps to mind straight away, but other things, there's scenarios as well. Andrea, multi-choice or short answer. So depending on your endpoint assessing organisation, they will book the assessment and they will typically send a number of emails and links to check that the software that they're using works. We have found on a number of occasions that if you're on a large organisation, these organisations have fantastic firewalls, but it doesn't, like the endpoint assessing organisation software doesn't work. So checking, working with your IT, you as the employer may be the one who needs to liaise with your IT team to either, I know some organisations have provided a laptop, well, it's just got that on it and nothing else, so it just works. Some organisations have been able to set profiles so that people can get onto the system, and it really would, I'd really strongly encourage everyone to check from the email exactly the software that's being used. There will be potentially a professional discussion. Typically, the apprentice would have collected evidence along the way, and they'll be having a discussion around their evidence. 90% of the time, that evidence is not directly assessed, but on some apprenticeships it is. So it's more about forming a discussion that they've had to demonstrate. A key word for endpoint assessment I always use is showcase. They're showcasing their best skills, their best knowledge, their best behaviours. So they provided 10 to 20 pieces of evidence that they want to talk about and showcase what they've done. They may have a presentation. It may well be that the endpoint assessing organisation has provided them with a topic that they need to present on, and there will be guidance about the number of slides, how long. I know there is, and it has become more and more relevant now, that the presentation is designed to be 20 minutes. And what they will do, the endpoint assessor, if it goes over 20 minutes, there's probably 1 or 2 minutes leeway, they will stop it there. So preparation, presentation skills and things like that are something the apprentice isn't necessarily being assessed against, but must have, because they can't ramble on. If it's an hour presentation, it's 40 minutes or 20 minutes of questioning. At 40 minutes, they will stop you and have 20 minutes of questioning. And typically, that's where the distinction of merit criteria is towards the end. They won't achieve that because they've not been able to present that. Practice, practice, practice is something I'd really encourage you as an employer to speak about and discuss with your apprentice. And they might have a project as well. And this is where the endpoint assessment process can last 3 or 4 months, because at the end, at Gateway, they're then given a project to work on. And that could be a combination of a report, a presentation and a discussion. So a number of other assessment methods within the project. And the one thing I'd encourage you to do is to ask what assessment methods are expected to be demonstrated at the endpoint assessment, because it's liable to be a combination of these. There's always, I believe, somebody else might shoot me down, but there's always a minimum of 2 assessment methods. But I know there's been 3 or 4, a combination. It depends on the sector, it depends on the apprenticeship, it depends on all those things as to what the apprentice is going to have to showcase and demonstrate. So those are typically 7 of the main ones. There are some others that appear, but they're typically the 7. They're typically the 7. And some might be very specific to the apprenticeship that the apprentice is completing. So really, you know, before we've got some questions, this last slide really is talking about, I'd like you to take away and think about you as the employer, how you and preparing for the endpoint assessment yourself, but more importantly, how are you helping your apprentice prepare for their endpoint assessment? So really that question around when you're talking with your apprentice is, do they know what to expect? Are they absolutely clear on what the endpoint assessment is going to look like? Right at the very beginning, almost, you know, when you've signed, before they enroll, almost confirming you at the end of this, do you realise you're going to have to do a presentation and a professional discussion, or an observation and a multi-choice test, whatever it may be? And having that confirmation all the way through your apprenticeship is key to making sure your apprentice is ready, but also prepared, and they're not in for any shocks. And also then your part as well will be to confirm you understand your role. What part are you going to play in the endpoint assessment? What part, you may be required to attend the presentation, but you need to be clear you're not expected to share or speak or just confirm, because I know some employers have started talking in the endpoint assessment, and the endpoint assessor has said, this is your apprentice's endpoint assessment. You're here to confirm and support, nothing else, and being very clear what your role is. And the two bits in the dark blue are critical, absolutely. I would say as early as possible to provide opportunities for your apprentice to practice their endpoint assessment. If they've got a presentation, give them at least the opportunity to present to you and group of colleagues twice, at least, managing their time, managing the slides, all those aspects that are involved in there. Having discussions with them, having a mock professional discussion, just asking them to talk through their evidence. And then the other key thing, because it is so critical, especially after Gateway, your apprentice may have to submit certain things within time frames. And if that is the case, making sure that they're working to their time lanes, because there's a lot of pressure on endpoint assessment organisations. They've got a lot to get through. There's a period of time that they expect it. If they don't get it, it could well be that the endpoint assessment is deferred, cancelled, rescheduled. And you don't want that. You want it to go as smoothly as it possibly can be. So there's quite strong rules. And as I keep saying it, making sure you're aware, especially your training providers working with the endpoint assessment organisation, that you know exactly what the expectations are and when documents are sent, and mapping documents and portfolios of evidence. I'm just trying to think of everything we send over. At this point, Caroline, I was wondering when you might want to add. You're muted. There you go.
I thought to myself, I'll let you finish and do all your talking and go through what you want to. So I'm happy to share some best practice. So hi everyone, my name's Caroline Walton. I manage an awarding organisation based at the Harwell Science Park. We look after 34 apprenticeship standards for their endpoint assessments. Best practice from an awarding organisation, or EPAO, an endpoint assessment organisation, is to try and support apprentices as early as possible. Some EPAOs will not engage before Gateway. No. However, open source materials, so I'm talking about standard assessment plans, any industry updates, things like that, can be shared with apprentice employers as early as you want. So a good way to communicate and to let apprentices know what to expect, and the way we do things is we go and do webinars, we do face-to-face inductions, we work in partnership with training providers, universities, employers, and we'll go in and we will have a whole cohort, or however many there is, and take them through the full assessment plan. So they will get to meet on slides, initially on a presentation, who the potential assessors might be that they will get to meet. They'll have no insights to what the exam questions are going to be, but we will introduce the team, so they get used to the faces. We will walk them through every single component, what to expect, how long it's going to last. We go through mock assessments with them. So not only do we support the training provider who do mock assessments? We will help do mock assessments as well, and we provide feedback on our mock assessments, so they have that prep for Gateway. I was just making notes as you were talking through your slides, just to see where I could possibly help. So I think if you can have an EPAO who will engage as early as possible and take some of that pressure off the training provider as well, that's really what you need. And then the apprentice, if they're uploaded onto the endpoint assessment organisation's learner management system as early as possible, then they can have that two-way conversation. An apprentice could phone us direct and ask any questions they want, and we will try and support them. And if you have that support and that flexibility from your awarding organisation, your endpoint assessment organisation, it's the same thing, then that is an amazing support mechanism to tap into. Also, you talked around Gateway and preparing for Gateway. Another really good tool is for portfolios, is you have something called like a portfolio matrix. It outlines everything that they're looking for in the portfolio or a project. They might give some hints and tips and guidance. Also, the key thing to remember with projects is that the apprentice needs to always remember about what they did, not make it personal to what they did. That then always scores brownie points instead of talking too generally about something. I think you'd probably find that as well, don't you, in terms of
use
also,
I instead of we in conversations is critical.
For if they have a Gateway declaration form from the EPO, that's quite often really helpful because it tells you exactly everything you're checking before it goes through to Gateway. For multiple choice questions, best practices to have an EPO that can offer both offline, online and paper-based assessments for different reasons. One, because there may be an internet issue, and quite often you might come across an employer that has very robust security protocols, and therefore you cannot take any kit into that employer. So therefore you must have all your assessments backed up by paper-based options that you can work with, so that learner's not disadvantaged. I'm just thinking about other things like observations. Again, security processes are really important for things like that. But tools you'll see assessors use are iPads, paper-based documents, maybe dictaphones, recording equipment, things like that. So, you know, it's good to have an EPO that's flexible, that can meet your needs. At the end of the day, it's the employer's money. So, you know, you're investing in this service, and you want to get the best service for your money. What are the things that other notes I was taking down? Projects again, have the guides and things. Make sure you get all that up front so you can really help that apprentice plan. It helps the training provider, and make sure your training provider and EPO do have frequent communication, and there's that really good working relationship there. What else have I got? Pass and distinction grades. So when the endpoint assessment takes place, there is pass, merit and distinction criteria depending on the apprenticeship. So for someone to get a distinction, they have to actually achieve all the distinction criteria. So when we're prepping our apprentices and giving them that support to support the training provider, we'll always support the training provider to aim for the highest possible grade, and having that frequent communication. So but I think the earlier you get the EPAO involved right at the start, to give the training provider support, to give the employer support and apprentice, the better. And I think that transparency is really important.
I think one thing to add, and I breezed over it, the most important thing that I'm laughing about it, but I know it happens, is know who your endpoint assessing organisation is. We've assumed you know, ask, because often there is confusion, you know. And the other thing I'd add, and Caroline, just to add to what you're saying as well, I know from the role that I'm doing, pretty much every endpoint assessing organisation has some fantastic resources. They always, whether it's plans, whether it's assessment, whether it's webinars, whether it's videos, whether it's documents, ask your training provider to provide you with them or show you where they are, because they are worth their weight in gold. I use them all the time to write my standards, but also to look at, because things change as well. That's the other thing to be aware of. Every 3 to 4 years or so ish, could be sooner, there will be slight changes, and you need to be aware of what the changes are. There's a big thing at the moment I've noticed about versions is that iFate is driven have gone from version numbers now and things like that, and you're like, when did that change? You know, it's those, because iFate, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, aren't really the best at communicating. You have to go and find out. Is that diplomatic enough, Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, I sit on quite a few trailblazers, so yeah,
I can hear that.
I always definitely I'm the one chasing them for things.
Yeah, Andrew, you got your hand up. This is moved into, by the way, we're already doing that. Questions anyway.
Questions. No, I was just going to echo what Caroline said about the distinction criteria and the pass and the merit criteria. And again, from previous experience, I've always used the assessment plans where you see the criteria from the very beginning and have the apprentice work to that from the beginning, because it's no good then getting to endpoint assessment and finding, well, we'd never be able to get the distinction because we haven't exposed the apprentice to that particular element of the standard. So they would naturally miss out on a distinction. And I think just going back to the planning, which is fabulous about dates and deadlines, is also to make sure it fits in not only with the endpoint assessment organisation but the employer as well. I know of one standard whereby the learner has to go out of the workplace for 2 days because they're doing a 2-day practical. So again, it's managing the workforce. And I think for those employers that may have apprentices doing more than one different type of apprentice, it's knowing what the theme of today has been is that every endpoint assessment is different. So if you've had one go through and think, oh yes, it's a presentation and an observation, we're fine with that. The next qualification might not be the same. As you've also said, the iFate, the standards change as well. So the assessment methods change also. And just to say about the employer being involved with the endpoint assessment, I do know of a couple of standards. I don't know of any employers on this call that are actually doing these standards where the employer does actually have to ask questions of the apprentice. So it's also being aware that you may well have to get involved. Having said that, for the standards I'm thinking of, the endpoint assessment organisation will discuss with you the questions that need to be asked, and it's a little bit of a tag team in asking the question. So just to know that you can sometimes as an employer be more heavily involved in the endpoint assessment rather than just watching a presentation. But it's great because it leads into our final webinar, which is going to be around projects, because again, even with the project side of things, the different standards have different aspects to the project and what is needed from that project. I think what is really interesting from a point of view from an apprentice and an employer is that employers are encouraged to give mini projects throughout the apprenticeship, the on-learning side, so that when a project comes up in the endpoint assessment, then the learner is not too fazed by having to do a project and knows sort of the mechanism that is needed. Sorry, Caroline.
I just wanted to mention about the presentation, just to help apprentices. You can always tell when an apprentice has really understood their KSBs, because on a presentation, on many presentations, they may put the KSB in the corner that relates to the part of the presentation that they're talking about. It's brilliant when you see them and in the recordings, and they've got these lovely clear slides. They've got KSB in the morning or KSB reference in the corner, and then it also prompts them of what they're talking about, because that's very clear to an assessor. Then they know exactly what KSB they want to cover here, or KSBs, because they might do several, and it's very easy then to sort of reference those parts of the presentation in the feedback. And feedback is really, really important. So even if you have a fail, then, you know, best practice is you give the apprentice feedback. What went well? What do they really need to brush up on?
can see that Rita's just typing into, I think, into the chat.
I say it's, we're getting close to the end. We've gone over again. No surprise.
Only by 4 minutes this time, Mark, which is good.
Sorry.
Good.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. No,
apologise.
this is a common occurrence now. But yeah, is there any? I can see Rita's typing away, but are there any sort of questions that you have or jump out? Please feel free to unmute yourself if you prefer to do that.
Just to say, everyone, I have to head off, but I just wanted to say this was absolutely brilliant session, really excellent. And so thanks.
You, Rita.
Yeah, really excellent session. Thanks, Mark, and thanks. Everyone's tips have been brilliant. So I really feel like I've learnt loads. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I have to.
No, that's fine.
No, hopefully we'll see you on the final one, Rita.
I'm just going to go to the final one.
Yeah, no, I've been really loving these. They've been so helpful. Yeah. So I have to head off, everyone. So thanks a million, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank
Rita.
you. Cheers.
Bye.
I've just moved on to the final slide there. There's the QR code there as well. It'll give you some details. And 10th of July. It's come around quick.
It has indeed. Yes.
Will be the final bit. We'll be talking specifically because, as Andrew, you said, and Caroline said there, if you have an apprentice who's got projects, there is some more detail that we need to go into about projects. One of the big one is a lot of people assume what a project is, and we need to define, confirm exactly, because we make some assumptions about projects, what we think, and this is more about what the endpoint assessing organisation knows to be a project and what's involved as well. So we'll be talking about some of those as well.
I think just to finish, Mark, on the projects, I had a conversation the other week the other month, I should say, with an employer, and I think even if you haven't got an apprentice that has a project in the endpoint assessment, I think hints and tips around projects in general and knowing about projects, because not everybody knows the full cycle of a project. So I would say even if you've got apprentices who don't have that in the element, is to still come along to pick up hints and tips around projects in general.
Just to say, and thank you for putting in there, Sarah, about what KSBs are. We live and breathe this stuff, but sometimes knowledge, skills and behaviours, typically it's the behaviours bit which really needs to be assessed. And in times past, it wasn't assessed as strongly. Now it is. And things like presentation skills, problem solving, these are all these transferable skills which are now embedded into the KSBs of every apprenticeship. And yeah, understanding presentation skills, understanding project skills, report writing and things like that are all been required now by employers, that they expect their employees to have these skills. So they're being built into the standards, the apprenticeship standards. So you're absolutely right, Andrew. Yeah, it's not just about those people who've got a project. I think those skills are fundamental for any apprentice, no matter what they're doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you as well, Caroline, for joining today. I know it was very short notice, but thank you. Your sharing best practice has been invaluable, and thank you for everyone that's contributed. We've had the slide up for a little while now, but yes, the next and final webinar on project is on the 10th of July. So hope to see you all there. I don't know if there are any final questions or parting thoughts.
Thank you for letting me gate crash.
No, not a problem.
Some really useful hints and tips from both of you. Thank you for providing us with that. I wish we'd had this before we had our apprentice.
It's funny you should say that, Sarah. A lot of employers do say that. Yeah.
If I had a pound.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.